Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Today's conversation dives deep into the science of learning, and guiding us is one of the field's most dynamic voices, Dr. Cynthia Nebel. Dr. Nebel is the Director of Learning Services and the Associate Professor of Psychiatry at St. Louis University School of Medicine. She's also held influential academic and leadership roles at Vanderbilt, Lindenwood, and Washburn universities. She's a core member of the Learning Scientists, a team making evidence-based learning practices accessible worldwide through blogs, podcasts, and videos. She's the best-selling author of two great books, Ace That Test and Uniting Learning Science and Talent Management. And that's where we're going to focus for today's episode. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome back to the program, Cindy.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Love to start the episode just with you, providing more background of what got you interested in this intersection between learning science and talent management.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of this started with my time at Vanderbilt. I was teaching in that education doctorate program. During that program, instead of having traditional undergraduate students in my classes, I was teaching corporate VPs. And I had to think about learning differently. And it became readily apparent that there were lots of applications for talent management. And in particular, I had fantastic students in that course. And one of them is a leader in the L&D world and wrote some pretty amazing papers. And my feedback on one of them was, you should write this book. And she said, no, we should write this book. And so we did. And so her contribution was kind of all of the talent management side because she knows so much in that space. And then I took and applied those learning science techniques along the way.
Well, let's get right into it. There's four phases of the talent life cycle. Let's start with that first phase, the talent acquisition, which is the beginning. It's where organizations embark on a quest to discover new members for their team. And it's more than just filling positions. It's an ongoing strategy crucial for the organization's growth and future success. And you identify three problems in this part of the life cycle. First, high recruitment costs and lengthy hiring cycles. Problem number two, identifying skills and culture alignment. And then problem number three, onboarding challenges and high turnover. They're really categorized under two main themes of strategic talent sourcing and optimized onboarding experiences. So let's first talk about that strategic talent sourcing and talk to me more about the candidate motivation, because an applicant to apply to anything, it's usually a very extensive process. It's a convoluted process, and they use a lot of brain power to decipher the text in an application, making the job itself sound much more demanding. How could you leverage learning science to help in this process?
You really hit the nail on the head there. The big piece from the candidate motivation standpoint that we focus on is the science of motivation and specifically self efficacy. Right, so self efficacy is our belief in our ability to be successful at any given task at any given time. And there are lots of things that go into self efficacy. But essentially, if we can break down the process and simplify the process of applying, then it makes people more likely to follow through with it. If somebody opens it and it looks like, gosh, this is going to take me 15 hours to fill out this single application, they're very unlikely to fill it out. The only people who are going to do that are people who look at it and think it looks easier for some reason, or people who are pretty high on the desperation chart. And I'm not sure that's the people we necessarily are searching for. We likely want the individuals who are super busy and don't necessarily have 15 hours of spare time to be filling out our application. So you don't want them to immediately go away from that application simply because it looks like too daunting of a task that I'm never going to be able to complete that. So why even bother starting?
So cognitive load sets in, and to reduce it, make sure that you break it up so that you don't have to do it all at once. Make sure the language is simpler, easier to read. It's not filled with convoluted jargon that people don't understand, and make the overall hiring process a little bit easier to do so that that cognitive load doesn't set in. They feel like they can do this, and it's something that is not as challenging or cognitively taxing for them to do.
That's exactly right. When you have that really, really high cognitive load, it makes the entire process seem a lot more difficult. Even by simplifying the jargon, by simplifying the text heaviness of an application, you can get more qualified applicants simply because it's easier and it doesn't feel as demanding to fill out that application.
And another critical issue in hiring new candidates is to ensure they fit within the culture and the mission of the organization. There's it's difficult to do when you hire new employees to try to identify that quickly and easily, especially when you're trying to describe abstract ideas about the company culture. It can be difficult for candidates to understand exactly what those are and what those mean in a day-to-day environment. How can concrete examples help with that?
So, concrete examples is one of the best ways that we have for folks to understand abstract ideas, but then also to be able to transfer them and to understand what they mean in different contexts. So, in an ideal world, you're not just going to give one example of your company culture, but a couple of different examples. So, for example, at my current organization, the job culture was described as being flexible. Now, what does flexible really mean? And that probably means something different depending on where you are. Does that mean the work hours are flexible? Does that mean it's okay for me to wear jeans to work? Does that mean that I can take days off when I need them? What exactly does that mean? And so making sure that when you use a word like flexible, you use it not just one, but multiple examples of what that means is going to help employees to self select into a culture that makes sense for them. I couldn't work in a position where I didn't have the flexibility to take off for kiddos' doctor's appointments, for example. But if that's not what that application meant, I'm going to waste my time and a whole lot of the company's time coming in for an interview to find out that's not actually what that meant.
Another great learning science principle is dual coding. And instead of just giving candidates information verbally, candidates really want to understand that work environment. The best thing to do is to show them and to describe it to them.
We suggest you could do video walkthroughs as part of that so that you could kind of see the company culture in action, even if you don't have the technical capacity for that in your organization. At least including some photos that represent what that means is going to give applicants a much better idea. It's going to develop that understanding much better of exactly what we mean when we're talking about flexibility or whatever else.
And keeping candidates motivated during the recruitment process without leading to high drop off rates has been a challenge for many companies. You give a great example in the book about the Cheesecake Factory, which manages in the hiring of over 40,000 employees annually, but they maintain a great candidate experience. And they use AI powered chatbots. But talk to me more about what they do that makes for such a different candidate experience for potential employees of the Cheesecake Factory.
So instead of kind of just having this bland, let's submit it, and it goes out into the ether and you don't know what's happening, they do personalized emails back to candidates so that they know where their application is in the process. They might even do phone calls to let folks know exactly what's going on. And so it keeps candidates feeling like the company cares for them along the way a little bit more. That's a company I want to work for, is one that is informative and caring about what my experience is as a potential employee. So I think that's fantastic. Another example we give in the book is about the idea of providing feedback to candidates on their applications. So even if it's unsuccessful application, to at least give a little bit of information about why that candidate wasn't seen as an appropriate fit. That doesn't always have to look like super personalized feedback. Although, in the world of AI, gosh, we can probably give more personalized feedback than ever before. But at least to say, this is exactly what we were looking for here. These were the characteristics that really were most important to us. And that is why we selected the candidate that we did, might be more useful than just either no response at all or a response that says, sorry, you weren't selected.
And I hear that a lot, that you just don't know where you are with the process. No one ever gets back to you. And most importantly, no one tells you what you could improve upon to be considered for an upcoming position that they may have. So that key is to focus on personalized communication using multiple touch points such as phone calls, emails, text messaging, even social media presence to keep candidates engaged.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on to the onboarding process. And the onboarding process is usually a fire hose approach, and that proactive interference often happens so that we're not even grabbing onto a small fraction of what they're saying. What would be a better approach using learning science to this onboarding process?
Some of those are things that folks have to know on the outset. Right? In order for you to start your job, you have to know these things. So we have to tell you. And that's part of the fire hose problem. Some of the fire hose problem is that they're regulatory things that we have to tell you this because legally you need to know this before we move on. But there are a lot of things that might happen during onboarding that don't need to happen on day one or even in week one, maybe not even in month one. So the first is just to spread out what can be spread out. So creating an onboarding process that isn't a week-long process, but might be a year-long process where individuals are continuing to get touch points. And then using spaced repetition and retrieval practice during that time can be really beneficial. If there are a lot of things that just had to be thrown at somebody in week one because it was important, we had to do that for safety or regulation purposes. Likely, if it was a safety or a regulation thing, that doesn't, it was important. We should probably bring that back up again, knowing full well that they probably did not retain everything. Maybe we have to cover it in week one, but then we can have touch points along the way over the course of the first year where we bring people back together and say, okay, we're just going to do a review of this one portion of that onboarding that happened, assuming you probably don't remember it, and getting that spaced repetition over time of the most important topics not only helps people to better understand it and to bring it back to mind, but it helps them to not forget it as quickly after those touch points. So we reduce the speed at which people forget over time.
And that proactive interference is such an issue for this process because that's where the ability to remember new information is hampered by the overload of previous learned material earlier in the day or earlier in the week. And you're right, that spacing out effect, if you can break it up more so that you don't have to just give it all at once, that's usually has better retention. And space retrieval, you mentioned that's probably your favorite, combining your two favorite
It
strategies
is.
for retention, right?
That's exactly right. And it's because they apply to literally everything. We talked about dual coding. That doesn't necessarily make sense for all materials. But when we're talking about spacing and we're talking about retrieval, you can use it for literally anything, for physical skills, for cognitive skills, for knowledge, right? It still works. So by all means, yes, that's my favorite. I wanted to come back because you did mention the proactive interference part. And right, this proactive interference is this idea that as we hear more and more information, it gets harder and harder to think about. Yeah. And we've all experienced that cognitive depletion. If you've ever had to sit through like a day of meetings, by the end of it, you feel like jelly. It's really a lot of proactive interference that's coming at you. And so those breaks are really critical. And so even if there are a lot of things that have to get crammed into that first week, maybe it can be turned into 2 weeks and you do an hour of learning and then an hour of on the job training of some kind, right? Of doing. And then maybe you come back for another hour of taking things in instead of what I often see is more like a here's a half day. You're going to sit here for 4 hours and learn. And now for the rest of the day, you're going to go over and do something else. Jumping back and forth would enhance that process considerably.
And just to reiterate and just to expand upon space retrieval, spacing contrasts with mass practice. So you're spacing out the learning over time, not in just one setting. And retrieval, it's closing the book and trying to recall what you just learned versus just rereading, having that sense of familiarity versus not a recollection, which processes it in a deeper way.
Both of those things are counterintuitive. They don't sound counterintuitive when I'm talking to educators, but for all of us out in the world, it actually feels like you're learning more if you're just reading it over and over again in one sitting. That feels so much better than if I read it once and I wait a week and read it again. And I'm like, I don't remember any of this. Why are we doing it this way? But it turns out that a week after that, you will remember so much more than had you just done it over and over in one sitting. Same thing with retrieval. If you close the book and try to bring that information to mind, it doesn't feel good. You fail at it some, right? But that act of retrieving the information leads to much better long term retention of it. And when we're talking about a corporate setting, retaining information is dollars, right? We're really talking about the bottom line here. And so, if we can increase that by using strategies that are more effective instead of wasting time with relearning, that's a good thing.
All about those desirable difficulties. You're right.
That's right.
So let's move to the second phase, and that's talent management. And this is that strategic orchestration within the organization aimed at developing talented individuals to fulfill both current and future organizational needs. In simpler terms, talent management is the roadmap and the toolkit used by organizations to nurture their most critical asset, their people. And for this part of the cycle, you identify once again several problems. One, developing future leaders. The second problem is around creating career paths. And then the third one is fostering organizational culture and employee well being. Love to focus on that first one because they really consolidate around two themes: leadership development and career pathing.
You're going to be the expert on this, Charles. You just talk. I'll just listen.
We still live in a cult of content where we just give them more and more content, assuming they're going to assimilate it. Something's going to stick and they're going to know how to apply it. That has never worked. That's not how our brain learns, yet we continue to do it for some reason or another. Talk to me more about prior knowledge and expertise, because when we bring people in for trainings, a lot of people have different levels of prior knowledge. Some are novices
Yep.
and they need to learn in a different way than experts. And you really need to connect it with what they already know. And many people feel like, well, I'm just going to give them these random facts and hopefully something sticks. Well, that's great for trivia, but not so good for learning in the corporate setting.
Honestly, it's not that great for trivia either. Even for trivia, if you already know a whole bunch about, I don't know, baseball, and then I tell you some fact, you're going to remember it a whole lot better than I am because I don't know anything about baseball. So that it's true in the corporate setting too. So when we are specifically talking about leadership development, if you have folks that are pretty novice in the organization or they're just dipping their toe into this idea of it's maybe their first leadership role and we're trying to give them some amount of leadership training. But those individuals who are sort of novice, they're not going to have leadership jargon. They don't know what authentic leadership means. They don't know what transactional leadership means. And so trying to talk to those individuals, if we're using all that jargon, they're just sitting there trying to follow the words coming out of your mouth. They do not have a chance to process the deeper understanding of that. Whereas if we have experts in the room who have been through 30 leadership development trainings in their life because they love this stuff and they suck it up, then they're coming and you're talking about authentic leadership and they're like, oh, yeah, I know what that is. So we have two very, very different experiences here. It turns out that when we look at prior knowledge, all individuals learn best if you can attach what you're saying to what they already know. If we try to learn things in isolation, we don't really understand it very well. One step further than that is something called the expertise reversal effect. And it's this idea that novices, they really do just need you to tell them the definition of authentic leadership because they've never heard it before. They need you to tell them. So that direct instruction really is their foundation. It's where they need to start. When we get to the experts, the folks who have been through this a few times, what they need is the opportunity to practice. They need more problem solving, more inquiry, more trying things out. That is how they are going to further develop. Just giving them more information isn't going to take them much further than where they are right now.
Well, and I've noticed too that for novices, their language is the concrete language, and you have to give them lots of examples so they can
Yeah.
connect that surface level knowledge and connect it in a deeper way. Because you're right, the experts think a whole lot differently. They have that schema. They're able to chunk the information and they can think at a much deeper level, and they need to practice around those concepts so they get better at those. Break apart leadership development between the retention and the application. So for retention strategies, space retrieval works the best to retain that information over a long time. We've touched upon that. Talk to me more about the application and the transfer, because that's something we always deal with leadership development is the near transfer versus the far transfer, not getting it to where they can use it in some meaningful way when they get back to the job.
Probably the two most critical things for transfer are number one, the concrete examples we already talked about. If you want folks to be able to transfer to whatever when they get back to their actual desk, they have to see concrete examples, but they need to be varied, right? If you give them two examples of feedback and both of those are with employees who made one mistake this week, it's two examples, but they're so similar that that's all they're going to be able to do with it. But if you give them two wildly different examples of giving feedback in which they're going to need to do this, and then they're in a new situation, they're much more likely to be able to apply that. But the other thing about transfer is all about, you said it, near transfer. So near transfer, it's this idea that all humans are terrible at this. We're all bad at being able to take information and transfer it. But when we learn, we can do just a little bit of transfer. So however we're learning it, we can apply it to things that are really similar to that, that are a little different. But trying to apply it to things that are very different is really hard. So, our job as leadership development trainers is to try to create as many examples as possible so that folks can see that and they can practice it. In order to be able to transfer those things, we need to be able to practice it, and we need to practice it in situations we're likely to actually be in. So you don't want to give them scenarios on a sheet of paper and then send them back to their office to put it into practice. That's hard to do. Rather, you want to give them scenarios on paper, lots of different ones, so they understand it, then have them practice those different scenarios in the training session, then send them back so that they can practice it in the real world.
That's such great advice there. And when someone learns something initially, the first step in mastery is having that shallow knowledge that they're not going to be able to transfer to a wide variety of circumstances. So, giving them examples that are as close as possible to what they need it for is essential. There's a great experiment that was done with physics students that were just novices versus physics students that were PhDs. And the experimenter said, identify these lists of problems based on the category they fall into. And the novices recognized, oh, well, this is a spring, this is a pulley, which was great because they were novices and that was that surface structure that they were looking at. The PhD students in physics looked at the underlying physics principles and they said, no, this is Newton's second law of motion. So just having that level of knowledge, you're able to categorize things differently and apply it in a myriad of contexts. But it takes time, it takes practice, and it takes seeing lots of examples so you can connect it in a deeper way.
That's why these experts are able to do this much easier because they've been living and breathing this for a long time. So they have a whole list of examples in their heads that have created those different understanding of those underlying concepts.
And I love the example that you give in the book. What Google does is it uses micro learning through whisper courses, providing managers with actionable tips via email, leading to noticeable improvements in that manager's behavior. And these tips are designed to be read and reflected on in the moments between meetings or during a coffee break. So perhaps this week's whisper course focuses on active listening. Here's a quick exercise to try in your next team meeting. An email prompt encouraging immediate application of that concept. It's breaking it down into smaller segments, identifying things that they can use right away and practice with.
You just talked about reducing cognitive load, spaced repetition, retrieval practice, concrete examples, and near transfer. I love it.
Let's move to that third phase, and that's talent retention. Holding on to exceptional talent in an organization is often an arduous uphill climb. It's defined as the organization's ability to keep its employees, especially the best ones, and involves strategies to prevent top talent from leaving, losing skilled employees, because that can be costly and disruptive for the entire organization. You identify also a couple issues with this or problems is that one, competitor poaching, which is always present, and I love the stat that you put in the book, and I actually even researched it and got an updated one. And according to Zappia, says close to 80% of job-seeking candidates in the market are composed of passive candidates, meaning they have a job, they're not actively looking, but they're exploring new opportunities when they present themselves. So that should be sobering and eye-opening for a lot of organizations to say, even though you might have a great group of employees, they're always trying to be poached by other people or recruiters trying to grab them. Problem two, undervaluation and discontent. That's huge these days. And then three, limited growth opportunities. So those are the three problems with this phase. And once again, they center around two themes. The first theme is enhancing employee engagement and then focusing on learning and development. One area of learning and development sometimes falls flat because it's a one size fits all approach. What could they do, organizations, in terms of making it more customized to the individual based on their background knowledge, based on maybe they're neurodivergent, to make them feel like this is contextualized for the way I learn best?
So the first is when we start talking about different learners, I always want to pause for a second and make sure it's clear that I'm not talking about learning styles. I'm not talking about individuals who necessarily learn differently, as in some people learn best this way and some people learn best this way. For the most part, with very few exceptions, such as neurodiversity, brains are brains and we all kind of learn the same way. However, we have wildly different preferences. So this really becomes a motivational issue. And this idea that we all like autonomy. We like being able to pick and choose how we learn and under what circumstances we learn. And so I think that's really what we're talking about here of creating autonomy for individuals so that they can make selections maybe at different levels. So I can self-select in and say that for leadership development I'm a novice, but someone else, you are an expert. And so we could self-select into different courses that way. There are other things where it might be based on interest or based on skill set. What skills do I really want to develop? What things am I interested in taking my career one step further? So I think autonomy is a huge part of that, of just giving people choice in how they want to learn. The other option, that's choice in what they want to learn. The other thing is how they want to learn, right? We can create live synchronous learning environments, and a lot of people enjoy that. That's my preferred way of learning. However, a lot of people are like, no, please let me get on a Zoom call to do this, or let me take a self paced course, or whatever that fits into their life a little bit better. So that signals to employees that we recognize you all come from a wide variety of backgrounds with different expertise and different interests. We recognize that, and we are therefore providing you the options to meet you where you are.
And you mentioned autonomy, and that's part of that self-determination theory that are the key levers for organizations to pull on to drive engagement and retention. The other two are competence and relatedness. Match employees to the tasks that they can master, providing clear feedback, celebrate that progress, and foster genuine connections, which I don't think we do enough. We are in an epidemic of loneliness. Try to identify mentor programs, team building, open communication, things that connect people with others so they can feel seen and supported.
I think a lot of that has to do with authenticity here too, because I've seen this happen time and time again where people create some like, oh, let's all have a Zoom party for relatedness. We're going to create teamwork. And it just feels like something that I'm being forced to do in this moment. But creating authentic relatedness is really what we're talking about here. It is genuinely making it clear that there are others in this space who care about you, who care about whether you're successful or not, and who are counting on you or are in it with you. Like, we're going through a hard time, but let's all recognize that we're all experiencing this and having those common experiences. But it's that authenticity that really matters. Just jumping on a call and at the beginning of the call saying, "Hey, how are you doing? How's your family?" There's so much to that, even though it seems like such a small thing. If you actually care about someone as a human, that matters a lot in this world. As you said, we have an epidemic of loneliness right now, and I think it's because people don't spend enough time doing that.
The other part of the learning process, especially with the training and development for adult learners, is around the mindset. And that never gets talked about enough. The growth mindset. I can learn anything. There's going to be those desirable difficulties. Praise the process, not just the outcome. I know that I do that with my kids. It's not necessarily the grades. It's, did you show the effort? Did I know that you're expending all of the effort that you can? If so, I'm happy with the result. So acknowledge that effort, learn from setbacks, and use failure and setbacks as motivation, as learning opportunities. Frame them differently. And the mindset piece is so important because if they're not coming into the learning experience with the right mindset, that's going to stop a lot of the learning to take place despite these great strategies.
But in order to do that, you have to create that culture that includes psychological safety. Failure has to be a safe thing to do in order for growth mindset to happen. Otherwise, individuals are going to shut down because it's not a safe place to take risks, to potentially not do as well as I had hoped to do. That really hampers that growth mindset if we're not telling people, hey, you screwed up. Isn't that great? Now we get to learn from that. Part of that requires us to be vulnerable too. For me to say, oh, I screw up. Here, let me tell you guys about this thing I screwed up on this weekend. And let's not learn from my mistakes. That creates that culture where failure is an okay thing to have happen.
You're right. Psychological safety and trust is the foundation of that to make sure that it's a safe place to share those experiences and learn from one another. So, the fourth phase of the talent lifecycle is talent exits, and that refers to the processes and the strategies employed by organizations when employees are assigned to move on from their roles within the company. This is often an overlooked phase, but it's critical in maintaining continuity, preserving institutional knowledge, and ensuring a smooth transition as employees depart and new talent takes place. And the problems that are associated with are knowledge gaps and disruptions. I've seen that quite a bit. Problem number two, insufficient succession planning, which is always in a reactive phase instead of a proactive phase, I find with most companies. And problem three is underutilization of alumni networks and resources. So when someone's leaving, I've seen this a lot. They leave and the knowledge is not passed through because of that curse of knowledge. The way an expert relates knowledge is not very effective for a novice person. How can learning science help with this transfer of knowledge that needs to happen as a experienced, maybe it's a senior level executive, leaves the company?
So that curse of knowledge, it even comes back to that experiment that you were talking about. The physics PhDs literally saw the problems differently than the novices do. And that's the problem. That if I'm an expert, I don't know how to talk about it. I don't know how to think about it as a novice anymore. I don't see springs. I see laws of physics. And so, in order to then take that knowledge that I have and share it with someone else becomes really difficult. And so, pretty critical in this process is making sure, as you said, that it is proactive. We need to be making sure that we have a knowledge sharing process early in the process, not, oh, someone's leaving. Okay, we have 2 weeks in order to gather everything that they know, but rather to make sure that we're thinking about this along the way. We talk in the book about an organization that has like an internal wiki that they keep track of what things are going on and what we know about them and what folks are working on so that that knowledge stays. But the other part of this is to make sure that it's a collaborative process. As the novice in this situation, if you come to me and you start talking about laws of physics and I don't know what you're talking about, I can tell you that. And then you can elaborate, you can explain, we can make sure that gets clarified. But that can only happen if we do some advanced planning for it. But making sure that we continually document what it is we're working on is one way to make that happen.
And using elaborative interrogation, asking how and why questions to make sure that you're getting the information that you need to do that job, and use storytelling. So many leaders still resist this. Our brains are wired to process, understand, and remember stories so much better than just disparate facts of information that are not related to one another. So use storytelling, use elaborative interrogation that would really amplify that process.
It's true. I mean, it's related to that concrete examples piece that we're going to remember things better if we're learning them in context. Our brains are hardwired to remember stories. And so I love this idea of having folks just sit down and tell us stories of things that have happened that are good illustrations of the things that you've been working on. It's one of the best things that we could do.
And also having a apprenticeship model instead of just a dump model where you just dump all the information on them in the last 2 weeks, like you said.
Yeah.
Let's have that apprenticeship model work through a longer period of time with them so they feel more comfortable in taking on that responsibility or that role once that individual leaves.
It's a tough thing because you don't wanna tell somebody, "We're planning on you leaving soon, so we're gonna put pair somebody with you to go and be." At the same time, having those sort of relationships just established that pretty much everyone takes on a mentorship model or an apprenticeship model, but everyone having someone at the level below them so that there's constantly this, what do they say? Like, as you climb, make sure you turn around and reach for the person behind you. If that is the company culture, first of all, what a beautiful company culture. But that also helps us with this issue of succession and making sure that we've got people who are ready to step into roles.
How can organizations reframe exit interviews and alumni engagement to create opportunities for spaced review and ongoing social learning?
This idea that as someone leaves an organization and they do take that knowledge with them, if they've had a good relationship, we don't all leave jobs because we're dissatisfied. We leave for career progression sometimes. And so if they've had a good relationship, utilize them. They are going to have networks of individuals that they know are perfect for a role at your organization that they're meeting. They're going to have new knowledge that they can bring to bear on the role that they had before. So, maintaining contact with individuals who have left creates not only an opportunity for knowledge sharing, but also better candidates applying for the roles that you have open at your organization.
Well, we've given our listeners a nice overview of these 4 steps. I think we've integrated some great learning science principles within each one of those 4 phases. What advice would you have for leaders and learning professionals seeking to become more efficient at this?
So much of it is written for classrooms, but so much of it is applicable. So as you're reading these things and people are giving examples for classroom learning, be thinking about how that might work for meetings, for trainings, for leadership, because so much of it is very, very applicable.
So you got adult learning and child learning. So can those principles really be transferred into adult learning very effectively, or does it take a new paradigm or approach?
Well, thank you for asking that. It's one of my biggest pet peeves in the entire world. This really is a false dichotomy. The primary difference between andragogy and pedagogy has everything to do with motivation and very little to do with how we learn. Like I said, brains are brains. And so for the most part, what we're doing works across age groups. It just might look a little bit different. We can't ask 4 year olds to write an essay about what they read last week. That's not going to work. Similarly, you're probably not going to be able to start a meeting that way either. Hey, let's all write an essay about what we learned in training last week. It's not going to happen. But it's a motivational thing more so than it is a an actual learning difference or strategy difference. It just might mean that when I use retrieval practice with my students, I can give them a quiz. That's going to come off poorly in a corporate environment, but sitting and saying, hey, let's take a minute. I just want you to write down what was the one big takeaway that you took from last week's meeting. And then we're going to share as a group. Now that sounds like a great strategy. Guess what? You gave them a quiz, but they don't know that. Everybody's happy still. It's collaborative knowledge sharing, but it's the same darn thing.
I love that. Thanks for providing that distinction. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Cynthia Nebel, for joining me again. It's been a great discussion. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
The easiest way is through the website, The Learning Scientist. So it's learningscientists, plural.org. And you can find more contact information for me there and lots of free resources on learning science.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.